I want to contextualize that. So in Bangladesh, an incident happened. So in the preface, when I was reading that Garambe, his own testimony is that sometimes when he would kill the babies, he
Mm,
was conflicted that how would he end the life of a smiling, cute baby, or the pleading of women. And then what you just said, that he's saying that it's a different state of mind, that how that dehumanization discourse can actually literally take us over.
mm,
And I want to contextualize this in Bangladeshi context. That an incident happened in Bangladesh where a woman was. Some people thought that she is there to catch babies and sacrifice some
right.
kind of. And and this is something very important for me, is that ordinary people, not somebody with a machine gun, somebody who has been trained in military, how ordinary people can turn so violent and end the life of a mother
Mm,
in public, in
mm,
broad daylight.
mm.
And and that tells that I think we are in a profound state of denialism, that we, the regular humans, are also capable of dehumanizing others.
That's right.
So that's, you start the first chapter with a very difficult story to read of Smith and Hose, two black men, and I felt that the story is incredibly important.
Mm,
And then you use the story to springboard and define dehumanization. Could you tell us about the story and
sure,
also define dehumanization?
sure. Well, the story, or the two stories,
Mhm.
are about the public lynching of two black men in the United States. So, your listeners may or may not know that in the United States, there were recorded more than 4,000 of these lynchings from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. This continued well into the 20th century. And the lynchings of black men, and it was primarily black men, not exclusively, but primarily, uh, were rather different than what one sees in the movies and on television. In fact, I don't think there's ever been an honest cinematic portrayal of this brutalization. It's really a stark contrast because we have a handful of realistic films about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, but we don't have this with the hideous things that were done to black people in the United States. Um, Now, a number of virtually all lynchings involve not just people being hanged, but they involve torture, bodily mutilation, and so on, of the most just unbelievable kind. You think when you read these accounts, you're reading something out of the European Middle Ages. Uh, so I begin with the story of Henry Smith. Henry Smith was a mentally disabled black farm worker in Texas. He was accused of raping and murdering a young child. Um, he fled. He was apprehended in another state. He was brought back. He allegedly confessed, though that's dubious. And I would, if he did, it was presumably under torture.
Of course.
Yeah. Uh,
Guantanamo Bay, right?
yeah. I mean, there were no legal proceedings. They
Hmm.
just took him,
Hmm.
and he was to be lynched. Now, his lynching was advertised. Um, it attracted a crowd of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people as spectators. Uh, it took place in the town of Waco, Texas. There were so many spectators that the lynching had to be moved outside of town. The town couldn't accommodate them. And, Waco was not a backwater, it was a dynamic little city at the time. So what did they do? First, they paraded him around on a carnival float dressed as a king. It was almost like a ritual of human sacrifice. In fact, there's a writer, Orlando Patterson, who compares these lynchings to rituals of human sacrifice. Then he's taken to a platform, and on the platform, there's a big sign that says justice. We have photographs of this. Any one of your listeners can Google Henry Smith lynching, and you see the photograph. His clothes were torn off. He was strapped to what's described as the torture platform. And members of the child's family then ran hot iron pokers up and down his body, burning him. Then his eyes were burnt out with the iron pokers. Then he was placed on a pile of cotton husks and burned to death. Now, these burnings, like the burnings, say, of witches in the 15th century, were carefully done, so the burning took place slowly and the victim was not asphyxiated by the smoke. He rolled out of the fire, he was pushed back in, and he was eventually burned to death. Now, there was a very festive atmosphere surrounding this. Schools were closed, saloons were closed, there were professional photographer on hand to take photographs, which were turned into postcards and sold to the public. After the ashes cooled a little bit, the crowd moved in looking for trophies, bits of bone, bits of burnt liver, little bits of hair that survived the burning. These were prized. They were sometimes sold. 6 years later, a farm worker, a black farm worker named Sam Hose, was accused of murdering his employer and raping his employer's wife and harming his employer's children. Hose was almost certainly innocent. We don't know if Smith was innocent or guilty. He went into hiding. He was found, and a lynch mob dragged him towards the farm where the incident took place. A train arrived. This is just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And the mob was frightened that federal troops were coming in to halt the lynching. And so they decide to lynch him more quickly. He's chained to a tree, and then the torture begins. Skin is stripped from his face, his ears are cut off, his penis is cut off, and his fingers are cut off, and he's burnt to death, just like Henry Smith. Now, one of my main purposes in beginning with these two cases is that they are paradigmatic examples of human brutality of the worst sort. That's a primary reason. Secondary reason is I present descriptions of how these victims were described in the press at the time, because these events, there were reporters there. The media was present, the media of the day in the late 19th century. And they reported on these.
Which year was it, David? If you do you
Hose
remember?
was 1899.
1899. Wow, that recent.
Oh, I could give you an example of a spectacle lynching that's still within living memory, 1934 in Florida.
Oh my God. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
these went well into the 20th century. They really did. Just like with Smith, just by the way, body parts were taken as souvenirs. In fact, Hose's knuckles were put on display in the window of a grocery store in Atlanta, Georgia, along with steaks and pork chops.
That confounded me.
Yeah,
that confounded me.
I mean, the sheer horror of this is unbelievable. And it's something that most Americans just don't know about. And frankly, probably don't want to know about.
Yeah.
So in any case, if you look at how the victims are described in the press, they're described as beasts, as fiends, as monsters, as animals in human shape, and so on. In other words, the descriptions portrayed them as subhuman creatures. And this was very, very, very typical of the representations of Black people, again, particularly Black men. The kind of dehumanization that I focus on in the book is rather gendered, right? It's the men who are monsters. Women are dehumanized too, but the form of it is usually somewhat different. Okay, so now that invites the question, the second part of the question you asked me, well, what do I mean by dehumanization? And that's a very important question to start with, because the term is used very, very loosely. So if you Google the word dehumanization, you'll get literally millions of hits. But if you go to these, you'll find that the word is used in all sorts of different ways. In all sorts of different ways. They're all, I mean, in every case, dehumanization is seen as something bad. But sometimes it's regarded as a way of speaking, just the using of slurs against people. Sometimes it's used as a synonym for cruel and demeaning treatment, and so on. So it's very, very important right up front for anyone who's talking about dehumanization, explain what they mean. Because if they don't, first of all, we're talking past each other, right? I mean, if you have one concept and I have another concept, then we're not communicating. And it's not that one is correct and one is incorrect. We just need to be clear about what we're talking about. I see dehumanization as an attitude. It's something that happens in people's heads. And it's the attitude of conceiving of others, normally whole groups of others, as less than human creatures. Now, let me make two adjustments to what I just said, or two refinements. Notice that I say less than human creatures. I don't say animals, because in certain forms of dehumanization, forms that I concentrate on in the book, it's not merely that the other is seen as a non-human animal. They're seen as something monstrous, something demonic. So that's the purpose of creatures. Second, although I see dehumanization as a psychological state, as something that happens in people's heads, it's not only that, right? To understand dehumanization, we can't just look at psychology. We have to look at political and social and cultural forces. We have to look at the context impacting on human minds. I mean, there's something about our minds, and I try to explain this, which makes it possible for us to think about others in this way. But we don't spontaneously do it, right? It doesn't, people don't wake up one morning and think, oh, those people over there, those Jews or those Muslims and so on, they're less than human. It's always under the impact, under the influence of influential people, often who frighten us into thinking of others in this way through skillful propaganda.
So propaganda is almost an instrumental part of dehumanization if you look at the historical evidence.
Yes, that's right. So if you take any genocide, for instance, the perpetrators are worked up by propaganda. Now, I want to again make a distinction here. Sometimes it's explicit and cynical propaganda produced by propagandists with the intention of motivating others, to kill. That's the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Rwanda genocide, the what I call the Myanmar genocide.
Yeah.
That's the case with all of these.
Yeah.
This is also, though, in combination with ideologies that are sedimented into a culture. right? So the propagandist lights a match
Mhm.
to some dry wood. That dry wood's got to be sitting there. So very typically, there's a long prehistory of discrimination against the group of people who are being dehumanized.